In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Tokyo's war rooms were filled with confidence. December 1941 had dealt a humiliating blow to the United States, sinking battleships and igniting flames across the Pacific. For Japanese admirals, it seemed proof that their nation's warrior spirit, forged by centuries of samurai tradition and modern naval mastery, would carry them to swift dominance. In press briefings and propaganda broadcasts, they laughed openly at the thought of American shipyards answering back. To them, America's industrial workforce was nothing more than a collection of mechanics, welders, and riveters, men and women who had never faced true war. Farmers and factory hands, they sneered, dismissing these workers as soft, mechanized amateurs. The idea that these civilian mechanics could rebuild a navy, much less challenge the proud imperial fleet, seemed absurd. One Japanese officer later recalled how the staff mocked American industry, convinced that Japan's carriers and battleships would dominate for years to come. Yet even as laughter echoed through Tokyo, across the Pacific a different sound began to rise. It was not the clash of swords or the boom of naval guns. It was the clang of hammers on steel, the hiss of welding torches, and the deep rumble of furnaces. From Norfolk on the Atlantic to Puget Sound on the Pacific, America's shipyards were already stirring with furious activity. Under floodlights that burned through the night, welders in heavy masks bent over glowing seams. Sparks showered like fireworks as steel plates fused into hulls. Riveters, often women who had never before stepped inside a shipyard, drove bolts into the frames of carriers, destroyers, and Liberty ships. The docks, once quiet after sundown, now thundered without pause. "We worked until our arms went numb," one shipyard worker later recalled. "But we knew every weld was another step toward victory." Japan had underestimated more than America's resolve. It had misjudged the nation's very character. The same so-called mechanics they mocked were the backbone of an industrial culture unmatched in history. President Franklin Roosevelt's words still echoed. The United States would be the arsenal of democracy. And in no arena would that promise be more powerfully kept than in the shipyards. Before Pearl Harbor, America's naval production was steady but not overwhelming. A handful of new carriers, a few destroyers each year. But after December 7, 1941, everything changed. Emergency programs poured billions into shipbuilding. The Maritime Commission, the Navy's Bureau of Ships, and hundreds of private yards shifted into a war footing. The men and women who once built ferries, tankers, and cargo vessels now worked around the clock to deliver the tools of war. Tokyo's admirals could not see it yet, but they had awakened a giant. The first Essex-class carriers, designed before the war but accelerated after Pearl Harbor, began sliding down greased ways into the water. Liberty ships, simple, rugged cargo carriers, rolled out in such numbers that they seemed to appear overnight. Every week, fresh keels were laid, fresh hulls completed, fresh ships christened with champagne that shattered against steel bows. The Japanese mocked mechanization, but mechanization was America's strength. Standardized designs, modular construction, and relentless efficiency turned U.S. shipyards into assembly lines on a scale the world had never witnessed. Where Japan built ships by craft, the U.S. built them by system. Still, in those first months of 1942, the contrast was stark. Japanese officers celebrated their fleet's dominance from the Philippines to the Indian Ocean. Yet American newspapers showed images of shipyard workers in coveralls, sleeves rolled up, sparks leaping around them. Propaganda posters reminded citizens that every rivet counted, every shift mattered. Speed the victory, the posters urged, and the nation obeyed. The laughter in Tokyo would not last. For while Japanese officers congratulated themselves on a decisive first strike, America's shipyards were laying the foundation for a counterstrike unlike anything history had ever seen. The clang of hammers and the glow of torches were not the signs of weakness the Japanese imagined. They were the sound of an empire being forged, one that would launch carriers not once a year, but nearly once a week. This clash would not be of swords or samurai spirit, but of steel, sweat, and industrial will. And as 1942 unfolded, the mocking voices in Tokyo would begin to fade beneath the rising thunder of American shipyards roaring to life. As 1942 unfolded, the laughter in Tokyo gave way to an ominous reality. America's shipyards, once dismissed as clumsy workshops for mechanics and riveters, had transformed into the beating heart of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. Across the nation, the thunder of industry became as critical to the war effort as the boom of naval guns. Civilian yards were rapidly retooled into war factories. At Newport News on the Atlantic coast, where luxury liners had once been crafted, workers now welded the steel bones of carriers destined for the Pacific. In Brooklyn, cranes swung over cavernous dry docks, lowering giant plates into place with a precision that astonished even seasoned engineers. On the West Coast, in Oakland, Portland, and Puget Sound, entire communities pulsed to the rhythm of shipbuilding, their skylines lit by floodlights that burned through the night. The statistics tell a story of staggering scale. By the war's end, American shipyards had produced over 151 aircraft carriers, 349 destroyers, and nearly 2,700 Liberty ships. The Essex-class carriers, designed before Pearl Harbor but accelerated under wartime urgency, began sliding off the ways like clockwork. Each could carry more than 90 aircraft, and together they formed the backbone of a fleet that would soon dominate every ocean. But numbers alone cannot capture the human element that powered this miracle. The shipyards drew from every corner of American society. Men too old for combat, women eager to serve, and minorities seeking opportunity all found themselves at the docks. African-American welders, long excluded from such industries, joined the workforce in growing numbers. Mexican-American laborers and Native American craftsmen stood side by side with women who had traded aprons for overalls. One worker from Brooklyn later recalled the relentless pace. "We worked until the sparks blurred our eyes. The nights were endless, but we knew every seam held back the darkness." In California, shipyard foremen spoke of women who could rivet faster than any man on the line, their arms bruised from the vibration of heavy tools. The conditions were grueling. Noise reverberated through the steel caverns of half-finished hulls. The hiss of acetylene torches mixed with the clatter of rivet guns. Oil fumes and welding smoke clung to every surface, and the heat from furnaces left workers drenched in sweat even in the dead of winter. Yet morale remained high, driven by the knowledge that every ship completed brought the war's end closer. The system itself was a marvel of organization. Standardized designs meant parts could be prefabricated at inland plants and shipped by rail to coastal yards. Liberty ships, simple cargo carriers, could be built in as little as 42 days, an engineering and logistical feat that stunned both allies and enemies. At the peak of production, yards were launching new Liberty ships every 2 or 3 days, an output so immense that it overwhelmed Japanese submarines tasked with disrupting supply lines. In contrast, Japan's industrial base was strained to the breaking point. Its shipbuilding relied on traditional methods, emphasizing craftsmanship over speed. Without the vast natural resources or sprawling industrial networks of the United States, Japan could not replace its losses at sea. Where America could launch a carrier every few weeks, Japan required years. Where the U.S. produced destroyers by the hundreds, Japan could barely keep pace with attrition. This imbalance was not lost on observers. American naval officers visiting the yards often marveled at the sheer scale of the operations. It was like watching an army of ants build a mountain, one officer observed, describing the swarms of workers moving across scaffolds and decks. By late 1943, the results were impossible to ignore. Fleets that had been crippled at Pearl Harbor were reborn with greater strength. Fresh carriers, destroyers, and transport ships flowed into the Pacific, enabling offensives that would push relentlessly toward Japan. What Japanese propagandists had once mocked as a nation of civilian mechanics had become a juggernaut of steel and firepower. The forges of Newport News, Brooklyn, and Puget Sound had turned laughter into fear. America's industrial miracle was not measured only in ships launched, but in the willpower of its people. Ordinary men and women whose sleepless nights and relentless labor reshaped the balance of the Pacific War. And as the new fleets set sail, the next test of this arsenal would come not in the shipyards, but on the open sea, where carriers and battleships would meet in battles that decided the future of the Pacific. Before America's great arsenal could be tested in battle, its fleets had to reach the war front. From San Francisco, San Diego, and Puget Sound, newly built carriers, destroyers, and supply vessels slipped into the Pacific, bound for Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and beyond. But between them and the front lay thousands of miles of open ocean, waters stalked by Japanese submarines determined to strangle the flow of reinforcements. The Pacific, vast and seemingly endless, became a battlefield of silence. Japanese I-boats, long-ranged and deadly, lurked beneath the waves. Their commanders hoped to recreate the terror that Germany's U-boats inflicted in the Atlantic. Convoys of Liberty ships, tankers, and troop transports carried aviation fuel, spare parts, and the aircraft themselves, crated and ready for assembly. Each vessel was precious. A single torpedo could send weeks of labor and millions of dollars to the ocean floor. To meet this threat, the United States developed floating shields of protection. Destroyers bristling with depth charges patrolled the perimeters. Escort carriers, small, hastily built flat tops, carried squadrons of Wildcats and Avengers, sweeping the skies and seas for enemy submarines. New sonar technology gave American captains a fighting chance, pinging the depths and guiding attacks against lurking shadows. The system was not flawless, but it tilted the odds. Eyewitness accounts from sailors reveal the tension of those voyages. One petty officer later recalled how nights on convoy watch stretched into eternity. Every ripple looked like a periscope. Every shadow felt like death. We slept with our boots on, waiting for the alarm. On some voyages, depth charges shook the decks as destroyers attacked suspected contacts, the sea erupting with thunder. Even when no submarine appeared, the threat hung heavy, a constant reminder of the razor's edge upon which the war was fought. Despite these dangers, the convoys pressed on, and the scale of their achievement was staggering. By 1943, American shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. Some yards could complete a freighter in under 6 weeks, and at the height of the war, a new ship was sliding down the ways every few days. This relentless production turned the Pacific into a highway of steel, a logistical artery pumping men and material westward in quantities the Japanese could scarcely fathom. When carriers arrived at Pearl Harbor, their decks freshly painted and hangars stacked with supplies, they were immediately pressed into action. Aircraft were hoisted aboard, crews were drilled, and within weeks they sailed further west to contest Japanese control. At Guadalcanal, at Espiritu Santo, and later at the Marshalls and Marianas, these ships became floating fortresses, sustained by the convoys that threaded the submarine gauntlet. Japanese officers took notice. Diaries captured after the war reveal frustration at their inability to halt the tide. "The Americans build ships faster than we can sink them," one commander lamented. What Tokyo had once dismissed as industrial weakness was proving decisive, as every convoy that arrived intact multiplied American strength at the front. The human cost was not small. Hundreds of merchant sailors lost their lives when their vessels went down in fiery explosions or slipped silently beneath the waves. Survivors clung to rafts in shark-infested waters, waiting days for rescue. Yet morale endured. Many sailors spoke of the pride they felt in their role, invisible to headlines, but vital to victory. By late 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Convoys reached their destinations more often than not, and each arrival marked another nail in Japan's strategic coffin. The Pacific was no longer a vast expanse of danger but a controlled passageway, patrolled and guarded by the expanding might of the U.S. Navy. The laughter that once echoed in Tokyo command rooms had faded, replaced by grim reports of fresh carriers, destroyers, and Liberty ships appearing in ever greater numbers. The Pacific War was turning, and it was not just the courage of Marines or the skill of pilots that carried the day. It was also the silent endurance of those convoys, the lifelines that transformed shipyard steel into naval power. And soon, these vessels would meet the enemy head-on in battles that would define the future of the Pacific. The convoys that crossed the Pacific did more than carry supplies. They delivered the ships that would change the course of the war. The first true test came in June 1942, at a tiny atoll called Midway. There, the U.S. Navy faced the Imperial Japanese Navy with only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Against them, Japan deployed 4 of its most powerful carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. The battle unfolded in the skies, where American dive bombers plunged through clouds to strike the Japanese fleet. In a matter of minutes, 3 enemy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze, their decks turned into infernos. Later that afternoon, Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, also fell. Midway had cost the Americans the Yorktown, but Japan had lost 4 irreplaceable carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots. For the Japanese high command, the defeat was a shattering blow. They had assumed that U.S. industry could not keep pace, that repairing or replacing a carrier would take years. Yet even as Tokyo studied reports from Midway, shipyard cranes were already swinging into action. The keel of the first Essex-class carrier, a new generation of fast fleet carriers, had been laid months earlier in Newport News. Dozens more were already in the pipeline. A sailor from the Enterprise later recalled the shock of returning to Pearl Harbor and seeing new ships taking shape all around the harbor. It felt like the Navy was multiplying overnight. Every time we came back from sea, there was another carrier waiting. Japan, by contrast, could not replace its losses. Its industrial base lacked the steel, fuel, and workforce to sustain such output. Aircraft carriers required thousands of skilled laborers, miles of wiring, and vast quantities of specialized steel. American factories had these in abundance. Japan did not. The Solomon Islands campaign that followed Midway, stretching from Guadalcanal to the seas around Santa Cruz, became the crucible where America's industrial machine began to dominate. Early on, the battles were desperate, with the U.S. Navy often outnumbered and bloodied. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, the Hornet was sunk, and the Enterprise limped away badly damaged. Yet by early 1943, replacements were already arriving. Escort carriers escorted supply convoys, while new fleet carriers slid into the Pacific, their decks lined with fresh squadrons of Hellcats and Avengers. Japanese officers began to notice the pattern. A diary recovered after the war recorded one commander's grim observation: "For every ship we sink, the Americans launch 2 more. We cannot match this." It was not just hyperbole. By the end of 1943, the United States had commissioned over a dozen new carriers, while Japan had managed only a handful, often conversions of civilian hulls rather than true fleet carriers. The difference was more than numerical. Each new Essex-class carrier carried nearly 100 aircraft, operated with improved damage control systems, and benefited from radar-directed fighter control. Their escorts, destroyers and cruisers produced in equal abundance, formed protective screens. Submarines and long-range patrol aircraft extended the American shield. For sailors at the front, this industrial tide was tangible. Survivors of the early campaigns recalled the relief of seeing reinforcements steam into harbor after months of desperate action. One petty officer put it simply: "We felt we weren't alone anymore." Every month, new ships came, and with them, hope. By late 1943, the Solomons were secured, and the initiative in the Pacific had shifted permanently. The Japanese still fought with determination and skill, but the imbalance grew with each passing week. What had begun at Midway as a narrow, almost miraculous victory became the foundation of a larger truth. The war would be decided not only by courage in battle, but by the relentless capacity of American shipyards to deliver steel, fuel, and firepower across the ocean. The battle lines of 1942 had been fought with fragile parity. By 1943, the balance was gone. The laughter that once echoed in Tokyo war rooms was replaced by quiet desperation, as Japan realized it was locked in a contest against a nation whose navy could seemingly never be sunk. The tide of war had turned, and with each new hull sliding down the ways, America's momentum only grew stronger. By 1943, the American war machine had shifted into a rhythm so steady and powerful that even hardened sailors could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. The Essex-class aircraft carrier program, conceived in the anxious months before Pearl Harbor, was now producing ships at a rate that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. These were not isolated achievements of individual shipyards, but the result of a nation mobilized for industrial war. Each Essex-class carrier was a floating fortress, 872 feet long, displacing nearly 27,000 tons and capable of launching close to 100 aircraft. Their standardized design allowed shipyards from Newport News to Brooklyn and from the West Coast to the Gulf to work simultaneously, using interchangeable parts and assembly line methods refined in America's auto plants. Welders, engineers, and draftsmen worked under floodlights, sparks cascading down steel scaffolding as the frames of new carriers took shape. Between December 1942 and the summer of 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers joined the fleet, in addition to over 100 escort carriers. The scale was staggering. In some months, new carriers were being commissioned so quickly that naval crews joked they were appearing like pancakes off the griddle. For sailors returning from the front, the sight of these massive warships steaming into Pearl Harbor or Ulithi Anchorage was both humbling and exhilarating. One pilot later recalled the moment his task force met reinforcements in 1944. "We thought we were the tip of the spear. Then we saw carrier after carrier on the horizon, more than we could count. It felt as if the ocean itself had turned American." Japan had no answer. Its shipyards, constrained by limited resources and constant bombing, could only manage a trickle of replacements, often converted merchant hulls ill-suited to sustained carrier warfare. Even the ambitious Taiho and Shinano projects could not match the pace or efficiency of the American system. Japanese intelligence officers watching the growing lists of commissioned Essex carriers wrote with alarm, noting that for every carrier lost by the U.S., 2 more seemed to appear within months. The impact on the battlefield was decisive. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, waves of American carrier-based aircraft overwhelmed Japanese pilots. Over 600 Japanese planes were destroyed in 2 days, many by Hellcat fighters launched from Essex decks. The Japanese carriers that had once roamed the Pacific with near impunity were now reduced to decoys, their air groups annihilated by the sheer volume of American aircraft. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Essex-class carriers formed the backbone of Admiral Halsey's fast carrier task forces. Their planes hammered Japanese battleships, cruisers, and carriers alike, reducing the once proud Imperial Navy to a shadow of its former power. The numbers told the story. While Japan could deploy barely a handful of operational carriers, the United States fielded dozens, backed by a vast armada of escort carriers supplying continuous support. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the material one. For American sailors, the sight of these massive new carriers represented security, confidence, and inevitability. For the Japanese, they were symbols of despair, reminders that no matter how valiantly they fought, the industrial tide was irreversible. A captured Japanese officer admitted with bitterness, "We fought ships. America fought with factories. We could not win." Life aboard the Essex carriers also reflected the scale of the effort. Crews of nearly 3,000 men operated around the clock, launching aircraft in tight formations, repairing battle damage within hours, and coordinating strikes across thousands of miles of ocean. Below decks, the hum of machinery mixed with the smells of oil and sweat, while on deck, the constant thunder of propellers and catapult launches created an atmosphere of relentless motion. These ships were more than weapons. They were ecosystems of war, sustained by the industrial lifeline stretching back to America's shipyards. By the end of 1944, the Pacific had become an American lake. Carrier task forces moved with such speed and power that islands once thought impregnable, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, the Philippines, fell in rapid succession. Each new Essex sliding down the ways tightened the noose around Japan, a steel reminder that the laughter once heard in Tokyo's command rooms had long since faded into silence. The Essex-class thunder was not just a symbol of production, it was the sound of victory, rolling across the Pacific in waves of steel and fire. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific Ocean was no longer contested. It was dominated by American carrier task forces that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. When the invasion of Okinawa began on April 1st, the U.S. Navy unleashed the largest armada in history. Over 1,500 ships, including more than 40 carriers, dozens of battleships and cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers. It was a storm of steel unlike anything the world had ever seen. For Japan, Okinawa was the last chance to halt the American advance before the home islands. With its airstrips and proximity to Kyushu, Okinawa was vital, and the Imperial High Command prepared for a battle of annihilation. Yet by this stage of the war, Japan had little left to fight with. Its fleet was shattered, its shipyards bombed into impotence. Instead, the Japanese turned to desperation, the kamikaze. Waves of suicide aircraft hurled themselves against the U.S. fleet in attacks of terrifying ferocity. Between April and June, more than 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched, slamming into carriers, destroyers, and transports. Survivors described skies crisscrossed with contrails and black bursts of flak, the sun often dimmed by smoke and fire. One sailor later recalled, "The horizon was alive with planes. Some burning, some diving straight for us. It felt like the ocean itself was exploding." American carriers bore the brunt of these assaults. The USS Bunker Hill was struck on May 11th by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds. Explosions ripped through her decks, igniting fuel and ammunition, killing nearly 400 men. Yet even as her crew fought flames for hours, other carriers nearby continued launching sorties. The rhythm of war, the launching of Hellcats and Avengers, the roar of engines catapulted into the sky, never ceased. This was the stark difference between the two nations' strategies. Japan gambled everything on dramatic, sacrificial blows, hoping to shatter American morale. But America's shipyards had created a fleet so vast and resilient that no single strike could cripple it. Damaged carriers withdrew for repairs, while fresh ones arrived to take their place. Within weeks, ships like Bunker Hill were back at sea, scars patched over by the unending flow of replacements from San Francisco, Norfolk, and Puget Sound. Japanese officers observing from Okinawa were stunned. Their diaries spoke of disbelief as new American carriers kept appearing on the horizon. One commander wrote bitterly that for every ship destroyed, 10 more arrive. They build faster than we can sink. It was the ultimate vindication of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy and the fulfillment of America's industrial promise. The battle raged for nearly 3 months. On land, U.S. Marines and Army infantry ground their way forward through fortified ridges, caves, and bunkers defended by fanatical Japanese troops. At sea, carrier aircraft flew thousands of sorties daily, bombing defensive lines, interdicting supply convoys, and providing constant air cover. Despite the kamikaze storm, the carriers maintained relentless pressure, their steel decks blackened by fire but unbroken in spirit. The losses were heavy, over 12,000 Americans killed and 36 ships sunk or damaged. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. By late June, Okinawa was secured, and Japan's last defensive shield had been torn away. The Imperial Navy no longer existed as a fighting force. The sky belonged to the Essex-class carriers, and the sea to the endless convoys that supplied them. Eyewitnesses remembered the eerie contrast in those final days. Offshore, the ocean roared with engines, contrails scarred the sky, and decks thudded with the constant launch of sorties. Inland, Okinawa lay in ruins, its ridges and villages reduced to rubble, its defenders annihilated. The war had entered its final, merciless stage. The Battle of Okinawa revealed the futility of Japan's last desperate hope. Kamikazes, once feared as unstoppable, were absorbed and answered by the sheer weight of American steel. Shipyards thousands of miles away had ensured that no sacrifice, however fanatical, could alter the course of the war. As the guns fell silent on Okinawa in June 1945, the lesson was unmistakable. America's carriers, dismissed as products of soft, civilian shipyards, had become the decisive instrument of victory. The laughter that once echoed in Tokyo's war rooms was now drowned beneath the thunder of propellers and the hum of factories that refused to stop. By 1945, the irony was undeniable. What Japanese leaders had once scorned as clumsy, mechanized labor had proven to be the weapon that crushed their empire. American shipyards, dismissed as factories of amateurs, had outbuilt the rising sun's centuries of martial pride. The mockery from Tokyo, that welders and riveters could never rival the warrior spirit of samurai, now echoed like a hollow taunt across a Pacific Ocean patrolled by U.S. carriers. The scale of the achievement was staggering. By the war's end, The United States had launched more than 100 fleet and light carriers, far surpassing anything Japan had envisioned. The Essex-class alone, 24 strong, became the backbone of the Navy, their decks bristling with aircraft that swept the seas clear of Japanese resistance. Alongside them steamed escort carriers, destroyers, and Liberty ships, a tide of steel so vast that historians would later argue the Pacific was won not only by admirals and pilots, but by the welders who worked under floodlights in Brooklyn, Newport News, and San Francisco. Eyewitnesses remembered the surreal sight of American harbors in 1945. Endless lines of new carriers slipped their moorings, their gray hulls gleaming, while old ships returned battered from combat only to be repaired in record time. A sailor later recalled standing on the pier at Pearl Harbor, watching fresh Essex-class carriers arrive even as the wounded were hauled into dry dock. It was like watching a tide that never went out, he said. For every ship hit, 3 more appeared. Japan's own commanders could not deny the truth. Captured diaries spoke of despair, of fighting a navy that seemed to multiply with every passing month. One officer admitted after the war that the Imperial Navy never understood that America's factories were the real enemy. While Japan clung to battleships and the memory of Tsushima, the United States had harnessed mass production, standardized designs, and industrial manpower to fight a war of attrition Japan could never hope to win. The legacy extended beyond the battlefield. When the war ended, surplus ships became tools of global recovery, ferrying food, goods, and raw materials to a world left shattered by conflict. Many Liberty ships found second lives in commercial fleets, carrying grain and machinery to Europe and Asia. American naval power, born in the crucible of war, remained the cornerstone of the post-war order. From the Cold War through to modern times, the Carrier Strike Group, pioneered by those wartime shipyards, stood as a symbol of deterrence and projection of power. For the men and women who built them, the war left a quieter memory. Riveters and welders who had once worked sleepless nights under rain and floodlights returned to civilian life, their efforts woven into the steel of history itself. Farmers who had left plows for shipyard cranes remembered the roar of engines and the smell of hot metal as much as the battles overseas. Together, they had proven that ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges. The story closes on a cinematic reflection. Picture the Pacific, 1945, a horizon filled not with a handful of proud battleships, but with endless rows of carriers, their decks alive with aircraft, their wakes cutting white scars across the ocean. These were not monuments to arrogance, but to endurance, ingenuity, and will. Japan had once laughed at the notion that welders, riveters, and machinists could win a war. Yet it was those very hands, blistered, calloused, and unrelenting, that forged the arsenal which broke the empire. In the end, the true warriors of America had not all worn uniforms. Many had worn coveralls, carried torches, and built a navy too vast to be destroyed. That was the legacy of steel, industry as a weapon, and victory hammered out on the anvil of democracy.